started. Welcome everyone today. I'm Professor Steve Schooner from the George Washington University Law School. I'm ecstatic to be here with you today with an excellent panel to talk about what I think is an incredibly important topic, sustainable procurement. I'll make no bones about the fact that I encourage the coalition to include it in the program this year. My sense is that there are some people who are working very hard in the field and some people who are thinking about it, but at the same time, particularly given how important the topic is, my sense is that not enough people are thinking about it, not enough people are talking about it, and most importantly, not enough people really know what it is they should be talking about. Now, if we take a half step back, and one thing we don't really have time for today is the fact that climate change is an incredibly important issue, and arguably, particularly if you have kids or grandkids, there's no bigger issue for us to be thinking about as a community today. But what we're really here to talk about is how all of this intersects with the world of procurement. And as we know, it's not like public procurement or government contracts isn't challenging to begin with. It's already unbelievably complicated. And it's burdened with social policies. We know the most obvious ones are distributing opportunities to small businesses. And so one of the questions is, how does it fit in? But the big questions that I hope we can talk about today are questions like, well, what does sustainable procurement really mean? You know, obviously today's session is not so much for government officials that ask, what am I supposed to do? But for businesses, how do I meet the government's need? How do I gain a competitive advantage? How can I make a difference in the new world of sustainable procurement? But fortunately, I am joined today by an extraordinarily qualified panel to help with this. We have Mark Lee from the General Services Administration, the Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Policy and Compliance. We have Holly Elwood from the Environmental Protection Agency, the Senior Advisor for Environmentally Preferable Purchasing Program. And from the White House Complex, we have Porter Glock from OMB's Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And again, as you all know, bios and pictures even are on the Coalition Conference webpage, so I'm not going to spend any time with that. But my goal here today is to have a relatively robust conversation. And as a participant, if you're with us today, if you have questions, I strongly encourage you to put them into the chat box, and then we can talk about the things that are important to you. But to get our conversation going, I'm going to begin with Porter. Porter, if you could just say a few words. So what is changing for the acquisition workforce with the administration's focus on sustainability? And can you explain a little bit of the federal acquisition community's role in climate adaptation versus climate mitigation?
Sure. Well, glad to be here. Thanks for being in the session. Happy to take any questions to the chat box, as Steve said. So yeah, what do we know? We're over 100 days into the new administration and lots of activity already and more to be expected. And I think it doesn't take a political scientist to understand the level of importance this administration has placed on sustainability and climate change specifically. I mean, if we look at the first week, there was 2 executive orders discussing climate change, sustainability, and procurement, and then in the first 7 days of the administration. So, I think the first thing to talk about what's changing is, I think the most obvious thing to me is a broader focus on climate change and what's been labeled climate crisis by the administration, rather than sustainability broadly, right? So in the past, we've talked about sustainability with some folks on climate change, HFCs, and asking questions about greenhouse gas disclosures. But really, we're in a sense of urgency. It is a moment of importance that the administration is focused on. How do we address the climate crisis? Okay, I'm saying something you all know. Well, what does that affect? How does that affect the acquisition workforce? Well, we anticipate changes coming in the very near future, but this administration has consistently talked about the power of procurement, the ability of the federal government to move markets and change demand. And it's really viewed, I think, as an opportunity to drive investment as well in American jobs and American manufacturing to be leaders of the new climate future. So I think for the acquisition workforce, it's a moment to pause and realize this is a call to action. This is a time for action. This administration is focusing on using all the levers available, including procurement. And we have a president who's very familiar with procurement, very interested in the topic, and how we use those opportunities to build the new climate future. you asked about mitigation versus adaptation. I think that's one thing that a lot of people need to understand. Very early in this administration, there was a discussion of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigating is avoiding the most catastrophic effects of greenhouse gases and climate change is by reducing our emissions. And adaptation is planning and preparing for the effects of climate change that are bound to come. So in procurement, our roles are twofold, right? We need to start thinking about, and there has been in the executive orders, directions of thinking about the social cost of greenhouse gases. Recommendations are due to the president in September about how to integrate the social cost of certain greenhouse gases in procurement and budgeting. And in the adaptation front, there's already been plans submitted to the OMB from the agency chief sustainability officers about how to best use procurement management and acquisition planning to work on climate adaptation. That is, how can we deliver our core functions in light of changing climate? And just to close up, I tried to address this to the acquisition community who may not be familiar with it. Steve touched on how we're a mile wide and an inch deep, and we have many issues, but this is one of increasing importance. But it's really about understanding how we can deliver our adaptation is really about how we can deliver our core mission services in the events of extreme weather events, flooding, other climate-related disruptions. And we did talk about, we've dealt with disruptions in the past, not the exact same, but we've dealt with government shutdowns. We've dealt with a changing overnight workforce and COVID. So these are things, models we can use to talk about still delivering core agency functions in the realm of climate change and climate crisis issues.
So I think that's a great way to start. And I love the fact that we talked a little bit about, there's a lot of vocabulary here. There's going to be a lot of communication required. One thing I think that OFPP has done really well over the last couple of administrations is doing things like Mythbuster campaigns where they can take the lead on taking complex ideas and explaining them to the community. So maybe there'll be a role in that, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. But I also like the fact, Porter, that you mentioned this is a call to action. So I'm going to turn to Holly now, and let's turn the lens a little bit. So for the vendor community, what actions can vendors be taking to communicate what they have to offer, the sustainability elements of their products or service offerings? And frankly, that's for the government or to other vendors, because going back to Porter's point, to the extent that it's a presidential priority, would love for you to sell sustainable products to the government, but would also like to see them broadly used in the marketplace. So, Holly?
Thanks for including me in this really important conversation, Steve. As the biggest purchaser globally, with $580 billion of products and services that we purchased last year alone, in the federal government, we have a real opportunity and a responsibility to use the power of our pocketbooks to try to drive change and shift to a more sustainable marketplace. And I think that is the thinking and the feeling of this administration. And they've really made it very clear that they want federal purchasers to use sustainable procurement as a way to reduce climate impacts with our purchasing dollars and to lead by example. And vendors are going to be key, and partnerships with our vendors will be key to be able to do that. And we've got a lot of tools that we'll be using to try to get there. We're definitely going to be purchasing a lot more renewable electricity and electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructures. The International Energy Agency just had a report that was issued a couple days ago, and they talked about how we need to move from 4% EVs to 60% of our fleets being EVs by 2030 in order to ensure that we stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal for reducing our climate impacts. So we've got a lot of really important work to do in the procurement field. So as far as resources that are available for that and actions vendors can take right now to help purchasers find your products that are more sustainable, you can take a look at GSA's Green Procurement Compilation or EPA's recommendations of specification standards and eco labels to get a sense of the standards and eco labels that are available today that address your product or service category. And I would recommend getting familiar with those standards or eco labels and understanding what they're encouraging you to do to try to make those products and those offerings more sustainable. And also consider whether or not you have the ability to get your products to be third-party certified to one of those standards or eco labels. It's a very easy way to communicate that you have met those sustainability goals. I'd also encourage companies to think about determining what your carbon footprint is, and then setting climate impact reduction goals and making sure that you have a real clear set of communication talking points as to where you are in your own climate journey. And something else that we've noticed is that most of the climate impacts are in the supply chain for products, in the manufacturing process. So manufacturers and vendors need to also ask their suppliers, do you know what your carbon footprint is? What are your climate impact reduction goals? And be really familiar with that and work with your suppliers that are high energy intensity manufacturers or have facilities that have opportunities to be more energy efficient, to try to get there and get reductions to happen. And I would also really encourage folks to take a look at the sustainability elements of their products and services, how they're reflected in GSA Advantage and in GSA's commercial platforms, in Amazon and Fisher Scientific and Overstock.com, and in our best-in-class contract vehicles. We've found that there's a lot of data that's submitted by vendors that can be out of date, and it's really important that that information is up to date and ready for purchasers who are going to be looking for that information moving forward.
So I have to say, I'm already glad I'm moderating this panel because I love that list. And I'm hoping after we're done here, Holly's going to share that list with me because we're going to circulate it. But I love this idea of measurable credentials, right? So we all know about carbon footprint, but all of the different things that Holly measured, I think are helpful in terms of coming up with a marketing strategy to speak to a growing market. And I want to go back to something that Holly began with because it's so important. Holly mentioned that 580, maybe 600 billion that we spent last year at the federal government procurement level. Remember, that's not including 50 states, municipalities, regional instrumentalities, nor is it including the international marketplace. And let there be no doubt in your mind that the European Union has been much more aggressive than us on a lot of these issues. And if you look at who's talking about the United Nations SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals, we're a little bit behind the global conversation on this. So as you go through that process of credentialing and articulating your competitive advantage with regard to all those credentials that Holly talked about, keep in mind that it's a big market and it's many other markets as well. So I think that's really a great place to basically play out. So I want to turn to Mark now. And Mark, so we all think of GSA as the center of everything commercial. And obviously we're talking about commercial markets here. So what role do you see GSA playing in helping the agencies leverage the procurement process to combat climate change? Obviously, we heard Holly talking about a lot of GSA initiatives, platforms, tools. And again, I guess this opens the door to cooperative purchasing as well. But Mark, what should we expect from GSA?
Well, thank you, Steve. I mean, I think what you expect from GSA is really to lead by example. We are the acquisition arm of the government. We do manage the federal buildings as the government's landlord, and we have an enormous opportunity to help our customer agencies out there, combat the climate crisis. And so, what we're really looking to do is make sure that we are providing access to supply chains from all of you, our industry partners, that is resilient and helps to adjust to the climate challenge and everything. And I think you hit on this point before, Steve, there's a lot of different objectives in the public policies that weave into the acquisition system. I started my career, buying IT in GSA. And don't forget what it's like to actually buy the goods and services that you need to get the mission of government done. And so I think the tremendous role that we have to do is make it easy for our customer agencies out there to meet these new requirements. And so there's a couple different ways that we're looking at that. First is that we manage a lot of the best-in-class contracts across government. And we're the category manager for a lot of those categories. So we're, a lot of our contract vehicles have already included sustainability requirements in there. And we'll be continuing to look at that even more as the policy around, climate develops, whether that's in the facilities and construction place, travel and transportation, our vehicle program, industrial products and services, IT, across categories of spend. Secondly, we have a huge role to play, particularly with the executive order of greening the federal fleet. So, currently we do provide fuel efficient vehicles. We're seeing actually an uptick and helping to move the market in that direction with more contractors wanting to offer that. But we do have zero emission vehicles and alternative vehicles direct for purchase or through our fleet leasing program. Holly mentioned some of the tools that we have out there, and we've enjoyed a great partnership with EPA. There's an environmental aisle on GSA Advantage. We've done some really great work the past couple of years, actually getting some of that data directly from EPA's product registries and not asking some of our suppliers to provide that. There are still some areas where we do ask to provide data, so we want our vendors and industry partners to make clear those requirements. It tails with our green product compilation tool that Molly mentioned, and my staff actually manages that. That kind of goes through and gives you like an easy answers to some of the things in FAR Part 22 about what I should buy, and then actually directs people to GSA Advantage to go and buy those items. The other thing that Porter mentioned is climate adaptation, and actually GSA within its sustainable facilities tool has a great way to walk the acquisition workforce of thinking through climate adaptation risk in the acquisitions we do. So we're going to be looking to build off those. We want to make it as easy as possible for the acquisition workforce and bake as many of these requirements into our offerings as possible. We do need the help of our industry partners, so we look forward to having that continuing dialogue and see how we can serve our mutual customers together.
Well, I don't think there's any question that, like the rest of us, GSA has their work cut out for us. And as I mentioned in the chat, I'm ecstatic to hear that we've got positive interagency cooperative work going on, because I think that's really important. But it also kind of brings us back to the regulatory landscape. Mark, as I'm sure you all heard, mentioned FAR Part 22. And I don't know how many of you have read FAR Part 22. And again, I'm not asking whether you read it today, but if you read it in 1984 or read it in 1989 or today, let me just suggest it wouldn't solve all of your problems. And so to suggest that there's a level of frustration with what's in the FAR and what isn't in the FAR, and more importantly, a lack of actionable guidance, it's a little bit of an understatement. Your average contracting officer, and for that matter, a lot of people who want to do business with the government, expect the FAR to be the starting point. They expect it to be the Bible and the roadmap. Well, FAR Part 22 currently isn't meeting our needs, but that's true for plenty of things in the FAR. But for example, you go to the FAR and the executive orders in the FAR aren't the current ones. And in fact, it's not just that they're not the current ones, but it's 2 or 3 executive orders round after round that was supplemented, implemented, replaced, and it's been out of date since God was a small child, which is really frustrating. But against that backdrop, I'm going to turn back to Porter, because at OFPP, somebody's got to be responsible. So what kind of changes can we expect from the FAR? Again, in the last administration, for a host of reasons, the FAR was very, very slow to be implemented. And if it didn't come from a congressional mandate, we basically didn't see FAR changes. So what do you see happening with the FAR in the next year, couple of years? What should we be expecting there?
Sure, and just to clarify, we're talking about FAR Part 23, not 22 labor laws and applicability.
Yeah. Sorry.
So, we'll start by looking at the right section, like the good bureaucrats we are. But so yeah, in FAR Part 23, so you're right. The FAR hasn't been updated for some time, and there were some proposed rules and cases opened in various states of processes between administration changes weren't finalized, and we're aware of that. So what can we expect in the FAR coming forward? Well, unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly what's happening because whatever comes about will take place through the normal FAR notice and comment process and all of that. But we certainly anticipate changes, right? As we talked about, there's the heavy emphasis this administration has placed on not just sustainability, but climate change more broadly. We anticipate changes coming into FAR in the very near future. So certainly keep your eyes out for that. But all those changes would take place in the normal FAR process. I think it's important if we're looking about potential FAR changes or what changes that can happen, we can look at specifics that have already been mentioned, right? So we know in EO 14008, there was two major goals that the domestic climate policy office action plan is supposed to take into account, and one of which is a carbon-free electricity sector no later than 2035, and a clean and zero emissions fleet for federal, state, local, tribal governments, including post office vehicles. So those are the two explicit goals that we've had so far that could have touched procurement. Additionally, I think it's important to look at the thought towards FAR rated changes that the executive order gave. Of 1408 also tasked the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality for recommending administrative and regulatory changes to the FAR Council for potential FAR changes and amendments. So that could potentially speed up the process as opposed to waiting for specific executive orders or other policy documents if the chair of CEQ can help guide the policy there. I also think it's that relationship with CEQ, when we talk about interagency working together, the current chief sustainability officer is Andrew Mayock, who is the deputy director for management at OMB at the end of the Obama administration. So it has been helpful working together. He has a strong understanding of what OFPP does, the power of procurement government-wide. And so having someone in that position as the chief sustainability officer of the United States is very helpful in understanding the lay of the land, the process, the regulatory timelines, and how to get the FAR updated in a timely fashion so we're not working with outdated regulations and from updated policy.
So I'm going to make a personal request, and I don't know, I can't speak for the community, but the one thing that I would ask is as you go through the next round of proposed changes for the FAR, I'm reminded of the reaction that I get from my students and the people who I talk to when I saw the recent executive order, and even more so when the Obama era executive order came out. And what people see is lots and lots of information and lots of detail, but it's too much. And the joke that we often talk about is that wonderful riff from the movie The Incredibles: when everybody's special, nothing's special. You tell me to do a million things, I don't know what to do first. And so I think it's really important, and this is why I talked about, for example, the Mythbusters campaign earlier. Clear messaging, try this, avoid that, those kinds of things, because it's not inherently obvious to your average operational level contracting officer how they can help you meet the objectives, even if they want to meet those objectives. Now, along those lines, this is where I think it's so important to have tools. And I love the fact that Holly mentioned some of them earlier. But Holly, can I come back to you? Can we talk a little bit about tools and resources? And I see that we're just getting a bunch of great things popping into the chat box there. But look, this is the bread and butter. People want to know, where do I go for help? So the worst case scenario in the FAR today is you open the FAR and it says, oh, here's the executive order. You don't know it's the wrong executive order, and it's confusing. So I love this. So Holly, please, let me give you the floor and let's talk about tools and resources.
Great, thanks, Steve. It looks like the links didn't come through on that cut and paste, so I'll fix that later. But we've got a lot of really good resources that can help vendors to provide more sustainable products and services to the federal government. The first one I wanted to mention is we put a document together that's called How to Sell Greener Products to the Federal Government that we wrote in collaboration with GSA, and we've updated over time. And I think that's a really good starting point for anybody who's new to this topic. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And you can find it at epa.gov/greener products as well. And we'll get you the link as well as we go forward here. Secondly, if you have not yet put a carbon footprint together, you don't know what a carbon footprint is, you're feeling overwhelmed, EPA has built a simplified greenhouse gas calculator that can be used by smaller companies or those who are at the beginning of their climate journey. So we'll also give you the link for that calculator. And we've been hearing from a lot of people that they're very interested in that calculator, and it's very useful for them. I mentioned EPA's recommendations of standards and eco-labels before, and we have a link already in the thread going for that to help you figure out what standards and eco-labels apply to your product and service category. We also have, if you've got a product you're selling to the government that involves a lot of water use, you can look at EPA's Water Sense program, and they identify water efficient products. We have EPA's Safer Choice program, which identifies products that use safer chemicals, often related to cleaning services and cleaning products. We have a program, the SNAP program, which helps to identify chemicals that are used for air conditioning or refrigeration or as aerosol propellants that have minimal impact on ozone depletion and on the climate. And we have a Smart Way Transport Partnership program, which can help you get your fleet to be as efficient and low impact on the climate as possible. And we also have the Comprehensive Procurement Guidelines program that can help to identify products that contain recycled content. EPA is in the process of looking at ways to revamp that program to become more efficient and get it into the next era of where we're headed on all of these topics. And using recycled content products does help reduce climate impacts because it minimizes the mining in some cases or use of virgin materials, which is usually more energy intensive than using recycled materials. So those are just some of the resources that we have available, and I'm happy to answer any other questions folks have or as we get into more discussion.
And again, I don't know if everybody has been following along in the chat box, but we've been dumping resources in there as quickly as possible. And hopefully we'll be thinking about other ways to collect them and share them over time. But I think it's been, if nothing else, an information-rich opportunity, at least so far. I want to go back to Mark now. Mark, you talked about being the government's buyer, and we often think of GSA, not so much in the defense community, but, being the center of all things government contracts and government contract or procurement policy. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. And as you think about the leadership thing or the message to convey here, I often think, and my students always know, that what gets measured is what gets managed. And we often think, well, why do agencies comply with their small business goals? Because there's clear measurement and they get yelled at by Congress if they don't meet the goals. So what can we expect in terms of leadership? How do we basically make clear from the top down that this is important and these are the things you should do and these are the things that people shouldn't be doing?
I think one of the things here at GSA is leading by example. And I do want to share an example in the climate risk management area where we've helped solve some of this problem government-wide in terms of some basic climate risk mitigation practices. And so a good example of that is our Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions contract, right? This is a $50 billion government-wide telecommunication contract, right? It's critical to modernizing IT across the federal government, but within that contract, we require all the service providers to submit us a climate change risk management plan, as well as some basic ICT preventative measures. And so a good example of some of those actions is just actually placing telecom equipment on rolling courts. So if there was need to quickly move them in an event of a extreme impending weather event, we've taken care of that. So taking care of things like that in a contract vehicle once versus thousands of times and potentially buying this across the federal government really does help address that list. So I think that's an example of us leading by example. And then the other example is putting tools out for us. The executive order, and right now the agencies are putting their plans to submit to CEQ on climate risk, but we actually have a framework out there that I talked about a little bit easier, that is, is a framework for managing climate risk to federal agency supply chains. And the framework prompts a user, like has them identify critical agency supply chains, assess the likelihood or consequence of climate-related risks. So that could be extreme heat waves, tropical storms, hurricane, wildfires that unfortunately happen almost every year, and what that impact is to your supply chain, and then develop a plan around that. So it's a risk-based approach. It's available on our SF tool. Lastly, to your point, Steve, I do agree. What get measured in the acquisition system does get that. In prior administrations, we've had some sustainability acquisition metrics. I think with this call to act on this crisis, that's something that you will see coming out from agencies. And where I'd say from GSA's perspective is our goal is to help agencies more easily meet those requirements, depending on the measurement that gets put out that. But I do expect that to come in the future, that there'll be some specific acquisition measures around, climate that will drive behavior in the acquisition system.
And, this might be interesting for the folks who are out there, particularly people who are newer in the field, but Mark mentioned the fact that some things had been done in the past that might be instructive. My students are fascinated to learn that until the FAR Part 15 rewrite, in the FAR and FAR Part 15, there was a mandatory evaluation factor, just like price and past performance, that required evaluation of the offeror's environmentally preferable solution. And interestingly enough, as part of the FAR Part 15 rewrite, kind of a sleight of hand, that fell out at the time and was never really replaced. But it was not so long ago when the government used to say, in every negotiated procurement, the contracting officer must use as an evaluation factor, what are the potential externalities or effects? What are the benefits of paying the price premium here? Or what are the downsides to purchasing, for example, the inexpensive fossil fuel solution? But that used to be a mandatory evaluation factor in the 1990s. So maybe as we think about things we need to do in the FAR, we'll go back to that. But I didn't see anything like that in the executive order. And so I'm not holding my breath on seeing that in a FAR case anytime soon. But to the extent that Mark brought us back to the executive order, and I'm going to turn back to Porter now, let's talk a little bit about the executive order 14008. I mean, I will tell you, when I read it, the first reaction I had was a little bit of disappointment, because we're having this conversation and we think that the enormous purchasing power of the federal government is a great way to show leadership on this. But the administration created a task force. They put OMB on the task force, and there's 200 parties on the task force, but they couldn't fit OFPP onto the list. To me, that doesn't send the right message. If you want everybody to believe that sustainable procurement is important, put OFPP on the task force, have the new OFPP administrator. Oh, wait, we don't have one. Sorry. When you get an OFPP administrator, get them out there and pound the podium. This is important to our community. But that leadership stuff is important. But anyway, Mark, so when we talk about the power of procurement, Porter, sorry. When we talk about the power of procurement and the purchasing power and how it drives innovation, what does this mean to you? And where do you see OFPP's role evolving as we try to drive this forward in the future? Because obviously you have your work cut out for you.
Right. Yeah, I was interested. I was thinking about what Mark was talking about by leading by example, and now we're talking about the power of procurement, and it made me think about the thing the president often says about we don't not only leading by the example of our power, but the power of our example, right? So I think in the procurement space, we can really do both. So on one hand, as Holly pointed out earlier, at over $600 billion in goods and services annually, we are the largest single purchaser in the world. We are the biggest purchaser in the world, and with that is a large amount of power. I mean, just pure dollars. And certain industries and sectors, we have enormous buying powers. In other industries and sectors, we are not the major player. And I think it's important, and I think this administration understands those differences, right? There are places where we do have the example of our power, and we can shift markets and change purchasing preferences and habits. But there are also places where we're not major players. So what does that power of procurement mean in both of those contexts? Well, to me, I mean, I think it's recognizing where we are a major player and using our status to affect change. I think it's also investing in new products and services and research and development and product and things where we can be a leader, right? We can be the cutting edge and invest in these product services and research development that no one else would really do. It is, the role of a government to do certain things like that, to look into the future and try to create solutions. So there's that aspect of procurement as well. And I think there's also a signaling function. There are times where we do lead by the example, the power of our example, where we decide to be a best customer. We view procurement as a way to affect socioeconomic change in many circumstances, and environmental change is a huge priority here with that. So we have the ability to signal changes and demands that often predate or are in front of the mass market. So if the government changes, the market will often follow in certain scenarios. So we can start those changes. I mean, I'm always thinking of, like, you see the California labels on all types of products, and California asks for something. Now we see it and here in Virginia or here in Washington, D.C., you see the California label. So that their action has changed things in certain places. I'm not pointing to that as a specific example of what we're going to do, but the example of a large procurement, and they're, not nearly the purchaser that we are, affecting change across not only the United States, but the world. Mm-hmm. So, I think we have the ability to lead both by example and to shift markets and demands in certain circumstances. And our interactions with the policy officials, they're very aware of those differences and very interested in those differences and what procurement can do, and understanding we can't shift all markets together. And there's certain areas we have more ability to affect. So having that understanding is great help in moving forward in the policy changes and in regulatory changes that are going to come or may come.
So I really appreciate the fact that Porter made the point that, Holly and I have both used the number $580, $600 billion last year in federal procurement. That sounds like a lot of money, but it's not that much money. And we may be the largest purchaser in some fields, maybe information technology, clearly defense, but we don't drive all the markets. Mm-hmm. And so I think Porter's point about what we have the ability to affect and where we may only be able to lead by example or by signaling is really important. And I can't think of a better example, because this is the one my students react to, than infrastructure. We read about this administration committed to investing in infrastructure. Wildly popular initiative across demographic and political lines. Everyone knows we need to upgrade our roads, our bridges, our internet, our healthcare. All of these things are critical. But interestingly enough, most of that infrastructure money is not going to be federal procurement money. If you're on this call, you probably appreciate that the transportation money will move through federal grants to the states, but those are going to be state investments. And so this is where the leadership sometimes can be more policy, but we can't move all those markets. And so maybe for GSA, things like cooperative purchasing may be more impactful than some things we do at the federal level. But in any event, many, many things to talk about here, and it's tremendously interesting. But I want to go back to Mark now. To the extent that we were just talking about, where can OFPP lead? So if you had a short list of priorities, right? So what are the big priorities? What are the big challenges in terms of implementing the climate objectives? I hand you this big executive order. It's thousands of words. What do you do first? What's really important to you? What are the impediments?
Thanks. I mean, I think our top priority certainly is focusing on implementing those executive orders. They really called out for us to develop some strategic plans around, climate adaptation and sustainability in general. So we're in the process of developing our climate risk management plan, that looks at addressing some of these risks from the economics, creating jobs perspective, saving money, prospering communities. I think the real challenge that we're seeing in that is improving, and Steve, you talked about that climate literacy. And so when I think about that from an acquisition workforce perspective, I don't just think of our contracting officers. They're one member of the acquisition team, right? And we do promote an acquisition team, but we've got program project managers, we've got contracting officer representatives. Our industry partners are actually part of the acquisition team at the end of the day. They need to understand all these requirements. And so really promoting that literacy and making it easier to understand is going to be an enormous challenge. I think it's an important role for GSA to do, and we'll be moving out with some of those training and resource programs in terms of tools. Obviously, our sustainability plan is addressing all our key areas of real estate, procurement. But one area I do want to hit that is really is a big impact and a big opportunity, but it's a challenge, is actually the requirement for GSA to green the fleet. And so we're developing an aggressive strategy to develop clean and zero emission vehicles, but it's a huge undertaking. It has many complexities. Before electrifying the fleet, right, we've got to ensure that, back to infrastructure, right, that we have charging stations in place, which, there's huge amount of investment being looked at that. So right now, our
Mark,
yeah.
I apologize. I would never interrupt on this, but I'm sure there's people out there thinking, but I keep reading about the Postal Service vehicle fleet. And so could you just maybe clarify for the folks in the room how you have a role and how you don't have a role in that issue?
Sure. I mean, in terms of we are the government-wide provider of the fleet. We do not manage the Postal Service portion of the fleet, but we do manage the rest. So, GSA is a key player in that, and we play a key role in terms of it, but we do not, operate and control essentially all of those vehicles or manage all those vehicles. So, it is a whole of government approach. We are closely working with CEQs and everybody else out there. But that is a multi-pronged strategy of, hey, we've got to work and focus on, we're looking at the infrastructure piece of that. We're looking at the maturity of the market over time. And I'd say the other challenge of us is a lot of people think our fleet is typically just the sedans that we drive down the street and everything. And we actually have a working fleet. If you think about the different missions of cross government, like we support, the Forest Service or things like fire trucks and ambulances and all those hosts of things. So there is a maturity in moving that market where, we are looking to signal that and try to influence that through the buying power of government, but it will remain a challenge of us in terms of implementing that executive order.
So I want to turn back to Holly and talk a little bit about standards and labeling. So I'm sure that plenty of people on this call are familiar with the concept of eco labels. I'm not sure that everybody appreciates how much eco labeling has proliferated in the last 30 years. In addition, I don't know if you can work it into what you were about to say, but whenever I'm at one of these conferences outside the country, the term greenwashing always comes up. If I can put an eco label on it and not change my behavior, I feel like I've won, kind of thing in the private sector. But if you could say a couple words about what EPA is doing with regard to standards and labels and how that can help us achieve our goals.
Okay, great. So when we first started the environmentally preferable purchasing program that I'm a part of in the early 90s, we were stood up by President Clinton to help feds buy more sustainable products and services. And we immediately started thinking about, well, how are we going to define what that means for different product and service categories, and realized that probably standards would be a great way to do that. So we tried to get the standards development organizations to see this as a great area of opportunity to move into. And they said, we don't buy it. We don't think there's any market there. And they said, you have to prove it to us. So we brought all the stakeholders together and we started working with the standards development organizations. And now we're at a very different point in time where there's over 460 standards and eco labels available globally, which can feel really overwhelming if you're a purchaser. But when you actually parse them out by product and service category, and you take a closer look under the hood at the various standards and eco labels, you can start to winnow out some of those and really get to a set that are credible, that really effectively address the key hotspots, we call them, or big impact areas associated with a product or service. So that's what my program has done. And so we assess and then recommend standards and eco-labels for use in federal purchasing to try to help get through those 460 standards and eco-labels and down to, we have 40 standards and eco-labels that we're recommending for use in 25 product categories. So that's one thing that we have done. And we also engage in building standards where they don't exist and where there's a product category that feds buy a lot of. And we have helped to get a lot of criteria built that helps reduce climate impacts, including incentivizing use of renewable electricity by the vendor and or by their supply chain, use of recycled content, use of reused critical minerals, ensuring that the manufacturing facilities are energy efficient. So these are the kind of things we've done. As far as greenwashing goes, the FTC has a set of green guides that helps to lay out what can and cannot be used as claims in the marketplace around the sustainability of a product or a service. And EPA collaborates very closely. Again, there's another collaboration that we can talk about to help update those green guides. And my understanding is next year they are going to be updated again to just make sure they're always reflecting the key questions coming up in the market around, well, what does this term mean? And how do consumers perceive that term when it's being used? And is that really accurate in terms of what the product is doing or not doing? So I would say that's a very useful tool that folks can take a look at to help figure out what kind of claims you can make in the marketplace today.
I find that incredibly helpful. And I personally find the whole eco-labeling thing to be, if nothing else, a fascinating case study in global messaging and cooperation. But before we start to wrap up, Mark, you know, a lot of people think about category management as being one of the big drivers in procurement innovation, economies of scale, changing our procedures over the last half generation or so. Could you say a word about how the category management framework plays a role in helping us meet some of these objectives?
Yeah, I think category management has an important role to play. I mean, at the end of the day, category management is about buying smarter and buying more like an enterprise, right? And so that in buying smarter, that means meeting public policy objectives like tackling the climate crisis. So, you know, within the categories of spend, we're looking at, you know, we want to take a look at rich data and say, where is the federal government buying? Where can we buy more sustainably? What does our suppliers look like in terms of their carbon impact, and start looking at and saying, how do we have general strategies within those categories to move that? And then really complement that with some of the acquisition vehicles that are best in class out in government to have those right attributes to help make that easier for the acquisition workforce across government. So I think if we're taking more of a strategic approach and looking at this in the general areas of spend, we'll reduce a lot of the complexity of this and make it simpler while still meeting those public policy goals. So we see GSA as a leader in category management, as a key role, having many of the government-wide category managers to dive in there and really work in there and demonstrate our leadership in that.
And I don't know about anybody else, but it was definitely worth being on this session if for no other reason that Holly has dropped into the chat box her email address so you can reach out to her directly, and more importantly has said those iconic words that she is here from the government to help you. So I believe that's true for all of our panelists, but since one of my responsibilities is to pay attention to the clock, and we've been trying to cover a lot of ground, one thing that I promised the panelists, even having warned them that I talk too much as it is, but that they would be able, uninterrupted, to each give you a closing thought or a takeaway before we wrap up today. So to the extent that I started with Porter, let me once again give the floor to Porter. What do you want the folks who are with us today to remember from today, or what other last words or recommendations do you have?
Sure. Thanks, Steve, for running it. I just want to say, you know, this is a time, there is a call to action here. This is a moment in time where this is of incredible importance. I started this by talking about, we had 2 executive orders in the first 7 days to talk about sustainability, climate crisis, and procurement. I mean, these are 2 major actions with minimal political staff currently in place as they're the first week of the administration discussing sustainability, climate change, and procurement. So it's clear this issue is here. It is not going anywhere for 4 years. It is only going to increase in importance. I suspect OFPP, OMB more broadly, to continue to hammer and pound the message of the importance of the contracting officer's role in this, us to try to simplify and give better implementing guidance for when other regulatory and policy changes come out. And I think those in the vendor community can also do their part, as Holly alluded to earlier, right? When you have a difference, when you have preferences and products and services where you can explain the difference, when you can help the contracting officer with their market research and differentiating values, that's going to be important now, and that's going to be important later. So understanding your supply chain, your unique situation is very important in helping us understand it. We talk about often at OFPP how full and open competition helps us in many, many ways, not just getting the best value for the taxpayer, but helping the contractors get that, helping the contracting officers get that value through their market research, through competition, through understanding the differences. So there is a call to action for the contracting officers and a call to action for the vendor community. And I think I just end by saying, this isn't a moment in time where the sustainability and more importantly, the climate change crisis is one of the top priorities of this administration. It sort of took me personally by surprise. I was used to changes of administration, discussions of sustainability, but the emphasis on climate change was beyond what I expected just from the rhetoric, we had all heard in media and campaigning and all that. So it's here. I am here with the full support of our office. They wanted me to be here. I am here on vacation and I wanted to be here, and they wanted me to be here to talk about it. And I'm here, the beautiful Outer Banks of North Carolina, a strip of sand changed by weather. It protects the mainland. It's changed by weather, and undoubtedly changed by extreme weather at a much quicker pace, which is like very obvious in some ways. It's no other place in the United States can see. And this is something that Steve started out the presentation, right? This is an issue you care about if you have kids, grandkids. I'm here with my young 2 kids under 5, right? This is an area I want them to see and experience and love. And if we all don't do something, places like this can and will change and not be what we inherited. So, it's something we all care about. We all need to take steps to make it better and improve what we've been doing. And I think this administration is really focused on that. And I think you'll be hearing more from OFPP and OMB in the very near future about it. And we look forward to working with all of you to improve the situation.
Thanks so much, Porter. Go ahead, Holly.
Wow. Porter said it all. That was awesome. Thank you, Porter. I think, this is a pivotal moment in sustainable procurement. We really have an opportunity to drive and reflect U.S. ingenuity and create jobs in America by shifting to get the sustainable products and services that we want to buy in the federal government and purchasers are looking to buy globally. So now is a really great opportunity to get creative together, to start on the journey and not be afraid of the journey, but work together on it. So my program stands ready to help anybody who wants to start out and is looking for places to do so. I'm happy to help connect you to anybody in EPA who might be able to help. My email address is in the chat box, and it's really, procurement is a critical pinnacle to all of this. We have heard the World Economic Forum has a report called the Net Zero Challenge, the Supply Chain Opportunity, and they've stated in there that 8 supply chains account for more than 50% of GHG emissions globally. And 4 of those are in categories that feds buy a lot of: construction, electronics, automotive, professional services. We've got a huge opportunity there to make a real difference in terms of what we're asking for as purchasers and what you all are offering to us as vendors. So I'd like to just encourage everybody to partner with each other, to put our shoulders to the wheel here together, and to show everybody what Americans are capable of. So thank you.
Outstanding. Thanks so much. Mark, last words.
Last words as well as say is we, in GSA, we can't do this alone. And with an acquisition, you as providers to the federal government or across government, have a key role to play. And so we need to continue the dialogue with you. We need to continue to work with you on how to do this in a way that makes sense in the acquisition system, that increases the value proposition that we offer through GSA and our programs and that you offer to our mutual customer agencies. But that means having a good dialogue and a conversation like we did today, and really hearing the feedback as we go along this journey. New requirements are going to come out, but it's us working together on how we implement them will judge the success of that. So I look forward to doing that with our industry partners, and you'll be hearing more from GSA. Thank you.
Well, as we close up today, let me just add my last words to this. The reality is climate change is real. There's part of me that's somewhat sympathetic to the science community that for a number of reasons was far too cautious in communicating the level of the crisis to us for many, many years. I understand they like consensus and they didn't want to scare folks, but we're in a crisis state at this point. The seas are rising, there will be flooding. We have melting ice at the top of the planet that is creating an entire new and disputed ocean. We're experiencing illnesses that have never been perceived before. Global food shortages will only increase, and we're seeing around the world the effect of climate-based migration, refugee populations, and the potential for war. So what I ask all of us is, what's more important? Clean air, clean water? These are critical issues. And if not now, when? So I encourage you, read about climate change. If you want any book recommendations, nonfiction or fiction, just email me. I've got a bunch. But more importantly, talk about climate change. Think about climate change. Walk the walk, lead by example. Let's be part of the solution. If you could all join me in electronically applauding and thanking the panelists. I thought this was great, and I really appreciate the time. And I thank the coalition for giving us the platform. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve, I just had one quick message from the coalition. So I want to thank everybody for your participation and for sharing your expertise in the sustainability panel. Our members really appreciated all the links that you provided. So as a follow-up to the audience, we're going to be posting a document that has all of the program links that were shared during the session. So do look for that. There will be a recording. And then from the coalition's perspective, we are going to be relaunching our Green Committee. So in the spirit of partnership that was shared from Holly, Mark, and Porter, we are going to be creating a Green Committee to delve deeper into these issues and talk more to you about that. So we look forward to that collaboration. And then in terms of next steps on the agenda, next will be the breakout sessions, and those will start at 3:55. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We
Bye-bye.
really appreciate it. Great session.
Thanks.
Should I stop recording at this point, or will you do that? I guess I'll do that.